X gon' give it to you. Wait for you to get it on your own. X gon' deliver to you. Knock, knock, open up the door, it's real. With the non-stop pop out from stainless steel. Go hard getting busy with it. But I got such a good heart that I make the mother one day.
Calisthenics is something you've done yourself, even if you weren't aware of it. If you've done push-ups, you've done calisthenics. If you've done squats, you've done calisthenics. It's a certain way of training that prioritizes using your body weight as resistance, rather than using equipment you'd find in the gym, meaning everything you need is always on you and you can work out anywhere you have the space to. But where and when did calisthenics come from? Most bar athletes would tell you the story of a bunch of ripped Spartans doing calisthenics in 480 BCE, and this surprisingly ended up even in the BBC.
Πρώτη αναφορά της καλλισθενικής γυμναστικής αλλά και του πώς οι Έλληνες οι αρχαίοι γυμναζόντουσαν είναι από τον ιστορικό Ηρόδοτο. Αναφέρει ότι ο Ξέρξης έστειλε κατασκόπους να παρακολουθήσουν το στράτευμα των Σπαρτιατών, οι οποίοι τους είδαν να γυμνάζονται με συγχρονισμένες και ρυθμικές κινήσεις.
Other stories include calisthenics done by Alexander the Great's troops, or by some sort of ancient medics in what is now China, to ripped ancient Persians. After ancient times, nobody seems to know what happened to calisthenics. One renowned documentary casually summarizes centuries and centuries of history as
calisthenics will go on to be the cornerstone of physical combat training in military systems across the world for the next 2,000 years.
Clearly there's a lot of confusion about its early history, and it doesn't help matters that the word calisthenics is never mentioned before 1826. In this video, through the use of historical books, thousands of newspapers, and a dive into OG YouTube clips, my hope here is to get us closer to the answer of where did calisthenics come from? Explain who first made popular push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, and other impressive calisthenic moves, and what is it really? That aforementioned popular origin story of calisthenics, that it came from the Spartans in 480 BCE, actually arose from a modern misunderstanding of what the ancient scholar Herodotus had written about the Spartans' training. If we look at the original Greek text, Herodotus had described the Spartan training instead as gymnazo, meaning the Spartans did gymnastic exercises. But gymnastics in ancient Greece had a completely different meaning than it does today. All it meant was that the Spartans exercised naked. Some historians, however, basically just replaced gymnastics with calisthenics, thinking they were the same thing. But surely calisthenics is rather a unique training system with its own exercises, usually revolving around push-up, pull-up, sit-up and squat variations. The problem is that in ancient Sparta, and really any time before the 1800s, we have no records at all of people doing the strict form push-up, pull-up, sit-up, plank, human flag, pistol squat, levers or planches that we know so well today. Now I hear you ask in the comment section, and thank you for being so polite. Okay Dennis, just because we don't have evidence of people doing what we would today call calisthenics before modern times, it doesn't mean that people before the 1800s didn't do these exercises. These records could have been simply lost with time. This I 100% agree with, but saying people before the 1800s did calisthenics is like saying people before the 1800s did things like parkour, breakdancing or techno dancing. Calisthenics is not how people before the 1800s called bodyweight training, but I agree that they may have done some of the exercises we would call calisthenics today. But if people before the 1800s didn't mention strict push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups and so on, then how did people exercise in the past? The problem answering this question is that our surviving records focus on ancient people's impressive feats of strength and dexterity, but not on what exercises they did to achieve them. Allow me to elaborate. For the ancient Egyptians, strength was mainly shown through wrestling, archery and acrobatics, instead of, for example, how many push-ups they could do. The Sumerians and Akkadians too adored wrestling, as did the ancient Greeks, appearing in their Olympics alongside running, boxing, racing with animals, discus throwing and long jumping. Although certainly some athletes may have done things like push-ups or squats to train, there are no mention of push-up, pull-up or squat contests. One reason why could be that contemporary soldiers had different priorities. Ancient Roman legionaries, for instance, needed huge stamina to be able to run long distances with heavy equipment weighing them down. Having a massive back or biceps would only have made that more difficult. The vast majority of ancient populations, moreover, had to spend far more energy just to obtain food or to travel, and therefore likely did not need nor have the time for push-ups, pull-ups or squats. Ancient acrobats too seemed to care more about handstands and tightroping rather than planches and levers. We should also keep in mind the endless variations to exercise. The modern writer Professor Willoughby compiled an impressive list of how ancient and medieval people showed off their strength throughout the ages, which I can try to summarise here. In antiquity, there are stories of people able to lift statues, boulders, wearing mighty armour and breaking bones with their bare hands. Vikings clearly drooled over wielding gigantic weapons or rowing great distances. Some medieval men-at-arms dreamt of cleaving enemies in two, splitting stones, firing from a sturdy bow, bending horseshoes, and lifting anvils. The great Mongols too were particularly infamous for their skills in horsemanship and archery, In short, did Willoughby mention any planches or levers during this time? No, but did these warriors train with what we would understand to be calisthenics today to achieve their feats? Maybe. But again, it's logical, but it's also speculation. Even after the advent of the printing press in Europe, when we received vast amounts of written records of all of a sudden of how soldiers were drilled, the focus generally was on the soldiers' postures, their marching, and weapon guides rather than their exercises. Another origin theory is that this workout system trained the armies of Alexander the Great, which comes from simply the fact that Alexander's personal historian was called Callisthenes, and therefore that somehow made him the inventor because his name sounds similar. According to Professor Sabine Müller, nowhere in Callisthenes' writings does he mention calisthenic exercises done by his troops. Alexander the Great, to be fair, did spread gyms across the regions he conquered in Asia, but again, no sign of pull-up or parallel bars. The idea that calisthenics was done by the Han Dynasty, as medicine during the golden age of Chinese history, is a similar story of historians trying to explain how ancient people did ancient exercises, but misleadingly using modern terminology. For example, Tai Chi, Qigong, or Huatoa's mimicking 5 animal exercises have all been described by some modern historians as calisthenic exercises, which as you can see is nothing like how it's done today though, as we're not walking around on all fours like bears, but these Chinese exercises actually do look similar to the early calisthenic exercises of the 1800s, of which I'll come to in just a moment. The supposedly ancient Indian sport of Mallakhamb, which according to Professor McCartney has not been found mentioned before the 1800s CE, is said to have hinted at a rudimentary form of pull-ups, but frankly I don't see how this was possible given a vertical pole was generally used. It has been said that
some exercises similar to pull-ups were mentioned in the ancient book De Sanitare Tuenda, also known as Galen's Hygiene.
Which is true, but Galen recommending something similar to what we now know are pull-ups does not mean that they did pull-ups. Galen had instead written of climbing up a rope with hands and feet, as well as hanging on a rope or some high piece of wood for as long as possible. Elsewhere it's reported Emperor Constantine I was doing an exercise very similar to today's push-up, which was quickly dismissed by an eminent classical historian. And again, we need evidence first before we can claim calisthenics began among the Shaolin monks. Okay, so when do we have our first record of a push-up and squat as an exercise? It could be that we have one for what we today call the Hindu push-up, which is like a sun salutation, and the Hindu squat, which is a squat but on your toes. In the 12th century Sanskrit text called the Manasahasaha in what is now India, my sincere gratitude here to Professor McCartney who was able to actually read the text. Here, elite wrestlers of the western Chalukya kingdom were sponsored by the king to represent his power and might, and possibly performed Hindu push-ups and squats as part of their training. The only issue with this and similar very early sources are that they don't actually describe the exercises the wrestlers did, but only write their names, which are already difficult to translate, as well as which muscles the exercises apparently targeted. The logic being the insert can't pronounce name were good for the upper body, so perhaps they were doing Hindu push-ups, or the another name I cannot pronounce were good for the lower body, so perhaps they were doing Hindu squats. If this is all true, these are our earliest records of a type of push-up and squat. Hindu push-ups appear in another claimed origin for calisthenics, the traditional Persian wrestling grounds called Houses of Strength, or Zarkhane, which is quite ironic given how we just saw the most popular origin story was of a Persian spy not knowing what calisthenics was. This origin story is also quite convenient though, as nobody knows when Zarkhane began and how they initially worked. Only since 1934 did this type of training start to become called an ancient sport or Varsi Bistani by patriotic Persian authorities. Our earliest records of Zarkhane, however, only appear in the late 1600s CE, but one of the foremost historians on the sport believes Zarkhane likely began between 1200 and 1400 CE, when wrestling gradually became acceptable among Muslim nobility. Those who would argue Zarkhane was done even before this, in ancient times, have to rely on linguistic and archaeological sources. To explain very briefly, those who argue it's an ancient sport claim the buildings where people exercise in Zarkhane today are similar to the buildings of ancient temples, and also point to the ancient names of weightlifting equipment that are still used today. As we have seen though, mentions of Hindu push-ups however only appear in records many centuries later, especially from the 1700s. In the 1770s, we can actually see visual depictions of Hindu push-ups and squats that would continue right up until the present. Yet, while we can see some similarities in this style of training with calisthenics, surely we can agree Zarkhane is still not calisthenics just yet. There's no sign of pull-ups in Zarkhane, for example. So where did pull-ups come from then? Pull-ups became popular as an exercise by students of Friedrich Jahn between 1810 to 1816 in Hasenheide, Berlin. The reason why was patriotism. Jan's homeland in what is now Germany had been split into pieces by Emperor Napoleon and others, and so Jan and his friend called Iselin created a workout system for guys, intended to strengthen those who wanted to create a united Germany, and one of the exercises included in their system were pull-ups, then called Das Cyclamen. Jan called the workout system Turn, inventing a German word for gymnastics, and published his book on Turn in 1816, so that Turn could more quickly spread around the German states. Jan claimed all the exercises in the book were created together with their students, so no one person was credited as introducing the pull-up exercise. Jan and Iselin also popularised the horizontal bar for exercise, as well as the parallel bars, pommel horse, ladders, and climbing masts, hence why some call them one of the fathers of gymnastics. To be sure, before 1810, acrobats were recorded using horizontal bars to exercise, but only for balancing acts, or doing 360-degree swings, some even said to have done them with one arm. It is through Jan's students between 1810 to 1816 that we also get our first records of the one-arm pull-up, as well as what we would today call the muscle-up, das Schwungstemmen. Turn began its spread outside Berlin, especially from 1819, when it was banned by the German authorities, and it even reached America in 1824. Now, while what we would understand to be squats, dips, and planks were included in Jan's system, push-ups surprisingly were still not. Here I'm in debt to Dr. Jan Todd for helping me find our earliest record of the strict push-up when I reached out to her. And while she found the exercise in an 1823 text, this text was actually a translation of an earlier 1819 book. Here in 1819, the renowned gymnast educator Peter Henry Kleist had created his own version of gymnastics based on the co-founders of Turn, especially Gutsmuth and Jan, and added to his own system what Kleist called kissing the ground in equilibrium with the hands and feet. Therefore, our first record of the push-up was as a warm-up exercise for wrestling, intended to strengthen Frenchmen. This name caught on until the 1830s, but then the name seems to have died away. I'll get back to push-ups in just a moment. It is often said that the word calisthenics comes from two Greek words, the first half meaning beauty and the second half meaning strength, kalos and stenos. But who first came up with this name? Well, let's welcome again the popularizer of the push-up and the inventor of the word calisthenics in 1826, Peter Henry Kleist.
You so fucking precious when you smile.
The success of Kleist's gymnastic book for boys, the one which had the first record of the push-up, encouraged Kleist to make a gymnastic system for girls as well, which he named calisthenics, but this calisthenics did not have push-ups or pull-ups. You have to understand, for most of the 1800s and often in the 1900s, the word calisthenics meant nothing like what it does today, because this early version calisthenics largely consisted of synchronized dancing movements. Think arm circles, arm raises, touching your toes, sit-ups, that sort of thing. This is why I think we should call the early version calisthenics instead as rhythmic calisthenics, just so we know which one we're talking about. Kleist went with the name calisthenics because merging two Greek words was the fashionable thing to do at that time, and it was clearly brilliant marketing as people still think today that it was done since ancient times. More correctly, merging beauty and strength in Greek should have been kalisthenia, as the absolute legend Greek linguist Professor Georgi Babinotti himself said, author of the 1982 Dictionary of Modern Greek. For context, in mid-1820s London, educators were trying to figure out which exercises boys and girls should be doing in schools, which would have far-reaching consequences. One author a year after Kleist believed exercises like long jump, high jumps, dips, pull-ups, pistol squats should be done for boys, while arm circles, arm raises, touching your toes, maybe pull-ups in some cases, should be for girls. Two writers the following year completely disagreed, believing girls can do any of those exercises, and even used the exact same engravings the previous author used in their books, but replaced the boys with girls. This caused a huge public scandal as exercises like pull-ups and dips were, falsely, seen as dangerous and unwomanly for girls to do, a trope that continues till present day. The next book I could find recommending pull-ups to girls was in the 1960s. So the name calisthenics originally was a private system of exercises created exclusively for upper-class women in London in 1826 to improve their health and grace. Because not even my granny was interested in why Kleist created his calisthenic system, what calisthenic exercise they did, and how the exercises evolved, I'll try to summarise the history of rhythmic calisthenics through these charts, and you can check out my footnotes for more information. The current image on the Calisthenics Wiki actually shows James Roper's gymnasium, with Jan-inspired gymnastic apparatus instead of calisthenics. But who then popularised planches, human flags, muscle-ups and front and back levers, even if they weren't called calisthenic moves originally? Okay, well here I can only share what I found to be our earliest records, but I'm hoping if more people search too, we can find even earlier sources. As none of these exercises had their own widely accepted names, just descriptions, I've had to basically spam keywords for months into English newspaper databases, German and French National Library databases, and cross my fingers tightly. And from my limited research, what we today call the elbow lever, then the Mayurasana, was first recorded in around the 900 CE in what is now India. A one-arm lever appeared in a Dutch fencing school in 1610. The rest of the moves likely all emerged from German and French gymnastics between 1816 to 1852 from the successors of Jan, as I couldn't find Jan himself mentioning the moves. In 1830, the Spanish refugee Francisco Moros introduced back levers and bent arm planches into his French gymnastic book. In 1832, the contortionist and gymnast von Klischnik performed what is now understood to be one-arm elbow planches and human flags when he mimicked animals on tour for pantomimes in France. His parents were gymnasts from Berlin, however, so it's probable he wasn't the first to learn these exercises. Muscle-ups, front and back levers were all recommended under different names as advanced exercises for boys' health in 1852 by the German physician Schreber, but it's likely these too were done earlier given the lack of sense of novelty. 1859 recorded a man, George Barker Winship, able to chin up multiple times with only his pinky finger. One crucial reason why gymnasts began to perform these impressive moves, specifically in the mid-1800s and likely not earlier, was because the Industrial Revolution introduced cheaper and more available metal, hence why the first recorded metal horizontal bar appeared only in 1850, allowing for more complicated and strenuous maneuvers, while more sitting down jobs made more people turn to gymnastics for exercise in their spare time. The mid-1800s were also when acrobatics started becoming popular in circuses, encouraging ever more spectacular feats. The earliest records I could find of a straight arm planche was in the circus in 1874, but this looks like an impossible double planche, as the top man is holding his entire body weight on the other man's head, when usually it is done like this. The next straight arm planche I could find was only in the 1924 Olympics, as before this date, the Olympics official reports did not detail if the planche exercise required straight arms. The Olympics also popularised doing certain tricks on the horizontal bar. Here's a quick chart to summarise, but please do comment if you found any earlier records. Okay, but if those moves were not originally calisthenics, but acrobatics, yoga, wrestling and gymnastics, then at what point did the word calisthenics begin to be associated with push-ups and pull-ups? From my understanding, incline push-ups began to be associated with calisthenics in 1842, but regular push-ups in 1887. In 1887, a soon-to-be hugely influential educator at the US Military Academy West Point, Hermann Kohler, published his System of Calisthenic Exercises for Use in School of the Soldier. This calisthenic system was inspired by the German gymnastic exercises of the Prussian Army, and calling it calisthenics, it was spread throughout the US Army and included push-ups, but not pull-ups. Pull-ups were mentioned in Kohler's system as a means of measuring the strength of soldiers, but they are not considered to be calisthenics. Pull-ups were not associated with calisthenics until maybe around the 1930s, more so from the 1940s, because even then not everyone agreed, as calisthenics was still considered something you didn't need any apparatus for, like a horizontal bar. In 1897, the US Major Edmund L. Butz's military exercise manual further included pull-ups, muscle-ups, levers and planches, but this was considered gymnastics, not calisthenics. One of the great classic bodybuilders that would later inspire Arnold Schwarzenegger, Eugene Sandow, also was a Prussian soldier in his youth and later recommended push-ups in his hugely successful 1894 exercise book. Another famous physical education pioneer, Dudley Allen Sargent, included bent leg push-ups and rows in his first American physical fitness tests, and it was from his so-called strength test for Harvard students that push-ups got their name. It was from around the 1890s that people started doing pull-up and push-up competitions in a handful of American universities, schools, or YMCAs. In 1896, gymnastics was included in the first successful international revival of the Olympic Games, although the exercises performed on the bar were only described as circus tricks and gave no more details. From the early 1900s, German gymnastic apparatuses began to first appear in US playgrounds. As a quick side note, we can evidently discount the idea that a Jerk Orvilla invented the push-up in 1905. This Jerk is apparently another name for the Great Gamma, a real legendary Indian wrestler, except no one called him Jerk Orvilla and he didn't do straight push-ups. The Great Gamma certainly popularised the Hindu push-up, or the dance though, but as we have seen, he was by no means the first. German gymnastics became the standard throughout the US Army in 1906, but sport would still prove far more enduring and popular. Following World War I, most touring organisations disappeared from America, as they are steeped in German culture. It is from the first quarter of the 1900s that rhythmic calisthenics became dominant in American, Nazi German and Soviet circles, although only English speakers called it calisthenics. In early 1920s America, Walter Camp's Daily Dozen was played on morning radios to encourage everyone to do 15 minutes of daily exercise. From 1929, rhythmic calisthenic exercises were similarly broadcasted every morning on Soviet radios, with 10 minutes of exercise often being mandatory in factories. From 1931, the Soviet Get the O, or Ready for Labour in Defence of the USSR, came into effect, which included the requirement in schools for pupils to do a certain number of exercises, including pull-ups. Rhythmic calisthenics arrived on Japan airwaves in 1928 in honor of Emperor Hirohito's coronation. It was broadcasted to the world in late 1930s Germany, most famously by Leni Riefenstahl. In China, Chiang Kai-shek, once he became leader of the Kuomintang, advocated for rhythmic calisthenics from 1927, but it would be only until 1949 that rhythmic calisthenics in China was made mandatory nationwide by the Chinese Communist Party and also played every morning on radio. Consequently, mass calisthenics was associated with totalitarianism and authoritarianism after World War II. Just look towards North Korea, Burnham's Guyana, Socialist Yugoslavia, Ceausescu's Romania, so it faded in Western circles, with the exception of Australia. Calisthenics would continue for sport training, as for example for American football, boxing, baseball training, tennis, volleyball, running, ballet, swimming, hockey, racing, skiing, basketball, football, and so on. It was recommended to everyone. Now, it's more simply called a warm-up. The calisthenics of which we know today, which can be described as freestyle gymnastics, I'm going to refer to as freestyle calisthenics to distinguish it from rhythmic and military calisthenics. But before I go into its origins, it's vital for us to first mention its preconditions in America. It was only from 1958 that the average Joe in US schools was required to do pull-ups due to the president's physical fitness test. Soon in US public parks, the installation of horizontal and parallel bars became more nationwide. The strength standards for gymnastics were also increasing, with the famous example of climber John Gill being able to perform one-arm front levers in the 60s. In the 1970s and 80s, German gymnastic apparatus became a common sighting in Soviet parks as well. And with the commercialization of television, classic gymnastic moves were catapulted into the mainstream. Bruce Lee did 2-finger push-ups and dragon flags in the 60s, Arnold was said to have done handstand push-ups in the 70s, Franco Columbu did weighted chins, Rocky did his one-arm push-ups in 1976, even muscle-ups hit the big screen in 18 Fatal Strikes Wu-Tang series, and Jackie Chan did pistol squats on film in 1978. Push-ups were added to the US president's fitness test in the 80s, and handstand push-ups were seen in Dragon Ball Z in 1990. Military calisthenics became a go-to for those who did not want to or could not afford to go to the gym or the gymnastic academy. Military calisthenics became so common in prisons as well, given the time restrictions for weight training or the lack of free weights shared with convicts in some US states, that it's sometimes even said that calisthenics started in prison. While no early bar athletes claim calisthenics began in prison, it is possible that some freestyle calisthenic moves did become popular from prison. In what is often said to be the first calisthenic DVD, Thug Workout Fitness from the Streets, one athlete who goes by Iborn performed chin-ups to his waist, what he calls the Running Man, Collect Cole, and the Hood Jesus in his jail clothes. This DVD was recorded in around 1999 and released in 2002 by a rap record label called Rough Riders to promote their latest album Ride or Die Volume 3. New York's underground pull-up culture in the 90s can be seen through Biggie Smalls' music videos. Iborn would later say he learned all these moves, what he called
gymnastics and aerial assault,
in prison in the early 90s, having also seen at the time one-arm muscle-ups in a prison pull-up competition and claimed that bar tricks were banned by his jailers. The Rough Riders DVD also included regular push-ups, pull-ups, upside-down sit-ups, one-arm push-ups, as well as human flags. Early hugely respected bar athletes like Hannibal and Beast had mentors who went to prison and later trained Hannibal and Beast in their own respected local parks and taught them how to do planche push-ups, for example. On the other hand, Beast claimed he came up with the idea of doing a one-arm pull-up by himself in the park when he was a teenager. Most early bar athletes did what they termed prison-style workouts in the 90s and noughties called Around the Worlds, and this generally consisted of 10 sets or more of high-rep push-ups, pull-ups, dips, and squats. As we've seen though, the culture of push-up, pull-ups, dips, and squats being a strength measurement originated in the military, but clearly flourished in prisons. Influenced by Thug Workout in 2002, the New York physical fitness program called Bartenders was created the following year on VHS tape in 2003, and its freestyle calisthenics was open to everyone rather than aimed towards only guys as Thug Workout was. It was originally intended to inspire and help at-risk youth off the streets and to stay in school, and the tape was boosted by a hip-hop platform called Sub-Zero. The moves shown by the bartenders divulged from traditional military calisthenics and gymnastics, as they encouraged and popularized doing creative spins on regular pull-ups and push-ups. Their impact was significant, as they reached a greater audience than Thug Workout in making freestyle tricks something people wanted to do. Bartenders was created by educators who called themselves Giants, Lace or Matrix, Mums, and Animal. It was the people at Bartenders that continued sharing the bar community to the public. More popular Bartenders DVDs were spread over the next few years, showing off the feats of strength possible by anyone who had the sheer motivation, health, and discipline. The Bartenders program was hugely successful, shared to tens of thousands of disadvantaged children in New York schools, juvenile detention centers, homeless shelters, inspired tens of thousands of underprivileged adults, and focused on their
character, attitude, and personality,
rather than on building athletes. It was through the bartenders that early legendary athletes like Hannibal and Beast were introduced online. Bartenders split in around 2006 for private reasons, with Giant leading the bartenders since then, but one key issue can be shared as to why it wasn't bartenders that made freestyle calisthenics global.
You understand? Because we can't battle each other, with one group we want battle.
There were disagreements on how to spread the bar movement even further. The same struggle happened in the 1930s Olympics, when the Olympic Committee debated a similar question: what is more important, health or competition? 2008 was the critical year for freestyle calisthenics, as the sport was created officially through the creation of two New York freestyle competitions, Big Guns in Long Island, led by Big Gun, and the Bronx's NBXA, led by the ex-bartender Matrix, which formally organised and named bar teams to face off against each other. The original freestyle competition teams were BXtreme, Bartenders, Harlem Seals, Highlanders and Calisthenic Kings, with others joining to compete soon later. These competitions further promoted freestyle calisthenics, but first I have to cover the typical narrative set at this point. There's a popular story that in 2008, the athlete Hannibal made freestyle calisthenics mainstream after a video of him performing difficult calisthenic moves went viral. Hannibal's influence was certainly massive as he became a household name within the bar community, but his international fame really began from mid-2009, when videos with him started reaching 1 million views. Calisthenic Kings were also very influential at this time on YouTube, but the first viral freestyle calisthenics video was actually a promo for a fitness VHS tape called 24-Hour Ghetto Workout that on YouTube outperformed all of Calisthenic Kings, Thug Workout, Bartenders and Hannibal's views initially. The success of 24-Hour Ghetto Workout and of videos like it may be why from roughly 2006, lots more people started calling freestyle calisthenics instead as Ghetto Workout, Hood Workout and Street Workout. More often in Eastern Europe, freestyle calisthenics started being and is still called Street Workout. Many early New York bar athletes still to this day try to stop these labels, arguing they're derogatory and you don't need to be in a street or ghetto or hood to do calisthenics, you can do it anywhere. But the counter argument is that street workout is easier to understand and remember than the mouthful word calisthenics. From 2012, many Eastern Europeans removed street from street workout and started calling it simply workout. To return to freestyle clips on YouTube, from 2010 the views were now in the millions. And this is not even counting the many DVD sales, calisthenic teaching classes, appearances on national television, and endorsements from celebrities like Jack LaLanne, Snoop Dogg, Styles P, and a few years later, Dr. Dre. YouTube footage of people doing bar tricks inspired further calisthenic celebrities such as Edward Checo, co-founder of BarStars in 2009, Chris Heria, originally for BarStars and then creator of Thenx, Daniel Vadnal from Fitness FAQs, Frank Medrano, Dennis from Barista Workout, the Bar Brothers, Dennis Minion of Ukraine, and many others who spread freestyle calisthenics to the tens of millions. The 2011 World Street Workout Federation in Latvia kickstarted the first official international freestyle calisthenics competition and was succeeded by hundreds more across the globe. In short, where calisthenics began is based on your understanding of calisthenics. If calisthenics is simply bodyweight exercises, then sure, it began in insert ancient time period, which could be true and is perfectly logical, but just keep in mind there's no evidence of people having done push-up, pull-ups and dips back then. If you think the origin is based on our first record of a calisthenic move, and you consider handstands to be calisthenics, then sure, it may have begun in around 2320 BCE in Ebla, today's region of Syria, but again, the issue is lack of records. Maybe you think it all started when the first bar community was created, then that would be with Jan students in 1810 Hasenheide, today's region of Germany, but just remember it wasn't called calisthenics and people likely didn't do freestyle tricks that we see today. If it's when the word calisthenics was created, that would be 1826 London, but you'd need to ignore that it looked more like a warm-up than a workout. If it was when the first pull-up and push-up competitions occurred in America, that would be around the 1890s, but it wasn't called calisthenics. You could say the origins were America from the 1930s or 40s, when push-ups, pull-ups and dips were becoming associated with the word calisthenics, but then the sport did not exist and there's still no tricks that we see today. If it all originated with the first freestyle gymnastic trick, the only problem here is that no one has made a clear list of what exercises are calisthenics and what exercises are gymnastics that everyone agrees on. For instance, watch this footage which looks like a calisthenics competition from today, but is actually a gymnastics display in a public park in 1948 Santa Monica. It wasn't called calisthenics then, but who decides? Original 1800s German gymnastics itself evolved, as we have seen, to include new moves in the Jan system after people started doing tricks like one-arm pull-ups, levers and bent-arm planches. If the correct answer is 2002 Rough Riders, this was a calisthenics only for guys, and if it was 2003 Bartenders, this was a calisthenics without the sport. You could say it all began in 2008, for when the first official freestyle competitions were created, like Big Guns and the NBXAs, but you need to keep in mind, it was only after these 2008 competitions that people started associating freestyle tricks with the word calisthenics. My views at freestyle calisthenics began in New York around the 1990s, or perhaps slightly earlier, when there's a fresh enthusiasm that it was not enough to show you're physically strongest by the amount of pull-up or push-ups you could do. You had to do something more. People started doing extreme versions of pull-ups like muscle-ups with one arm, which I haven't found recorded before, and this separated it from the calisthenics done in the military. In a similar way, freestyle calisthenics became different to gymnastics because it included moves normal gymnasts didn't train for, such as planches on only one's thumbs, touching toes push-ups, 720-degree spinning muscle-ups, one-arm front lever pull-ups, and so on. Basically, it became gymnastics, but with more creativity. Thanks for watching.